Hi, this is Paul. I'm going to continue on with the series in the C.S. Lewis Ransom trilogy, Space trilogy, however you want to call it, and get into Perelandra. There's a lot of stuff in Perelandra that I think is super interesting. Just to catch you up on the story, Out of the Silent Planet ends with Ransom coming back to Earth and meeting Lewis, his friend. And of course, Ransom is Tolkien, and Lewis is Lewis, and it's again, you have the sense that these college professors are just having fun with fiction, and they're getting to do things with fiction. I mean, they're such masters of it. They play with it in the way that most of us, if we were to attempt fiction, would really have to get serious about it. These guys are such masters. They play anyway. So there's some end stuff at the end of Out of the Silent Planet that sort of contextualizes it. And then at the beginning of Perelandra, Ransom asks Lewis to come, and Lewis doesn't know why. He gets there. He realizes on the way there that there's fear welling up in him. He's going to meet the Andila at Ransom's house, and he gets there and he discovers that he has to help Ransom because the Oyarsa of Malacandra, that's like the principality, the governing angel of Malacandra, has a mission for him, and he's going to send him to Perelandra. Doesn't tell him why he's going to send him to Perelandra, so Ransom has to strip himself naked. He gets into this little pod or something, and Oyarsa himself is going to transport Ransom to Perelandra. And so he gets him to Perelandra, and he drops him in the middle of a great sea. And so you have all of the first number of chapters are all about the particularities of Perelandra, these floating islands, which are very interesting. And he still doesn't know his purpose there. And then he discovers a green woman, and she's also naked. Now remember, Ransom's naked; he has no clothes. Perelandra's naked. I just finished my conversation with Richard Rowland. Richard Rowland talked about the fact that when he was a boy, his parents wouldn't let him read Perelandra because it had a naked lady in it. So, and very quickly you get the sense that the naked woman of Perelandra is, in a sense, Perelandra's or Venus's Eve. And then so you wonder, well, what role will Ransom play? Well, there's a king, and I'm only up to chapter 14, haven't met the king yet. We've just heard about the king. Eventually we find a fixed island as opposed to the floating islands. And then at one point he and the woman see something careening out of the sky. Now, part of what's genius about this book is this is Lewis wrestling with a whole variety of issues to try to imagine a prelapsarian state of the universe. And so much of what he's dealing with has to deal with this what I mean by prelapsarian. This is before the fall. This is sort of the universe before human rebellion. And so Lewis is playing with all of these ideas. And I find this tremendously important because actually I'll just talk about Reformed theology because that's what I was schooled in. There's really, this is a very difficult thing right now, and has been made difficult in some ways by the modernist fundamentalist questions, because it gets into what exactly is the nature of the fall? What exactly do we lose? What exactly has been corrupted? And so much, especially of these early chapters, Lewis is just exploring in all of the subtle ways that he uses to identify the woman and to describe her reactions to Ransom and their conversations. It's really masterfully done, and just this one going through that I'm going through now, I just get the sense of there's so much more there to mine, but I'm not going to do that. I want to get all the way to chapter 7. So Ransom and the woman see something falling out of the sky, and they look out, and he very quickly realizes that this is another spaceship, like the one that took him to Malacandra, to Mars. And so then he wonders how many are in it. Now, there's real character development between the books. So, Out of the Silent Planet, Weston and Divine are basically there sort of to, they're looking for gold. And so, in that sense, there's this very interesting progression in the characters of, well, we'll just talk about Weston, in the character of Weston. That in Out of the Silent Planet, he's an engineer, he's a British colonist or imperialist, and he's looking for gold, and it might even be sort of like Spaniards coming to the New World, and all they want is gold. That's all they want is gold. And so they come to the New World, they come to the Caribbean, and they rape and they pillage, and they're just trying to take gold out of the New World and bring it to the Old World. And there are all these subtle themes running through it. Now, this is going to change in Perelandra, because I'm gonna play the part where he then meets Weston, and we'll talk about how exactly this starts to unfold, because there's real development. Now, this is full of spoilers, so if you don't want spoilers, don't listen to this. But the book has been out a very long time. It's available all over the place. There's all kinds of people talking about it. Weston is eventually, well, maybe I'll wait until we get to that part of the story. But this is where Weston and Ransom meet each other, and some of the initial exchanges with the woman.
In all the circumstances, it would have been reasonable to expect that Weston would be much more taken aback at Ransom's presence than Ransom could be at his. But if he were, he showed no sign of it. And Ransom could hardly help admiring the massive egoism which enabled this man, in the very moment of his arrival on an unknown world, to stand there unmoved in all his authoritative vulgarity, his arms akimbo, his face scowling, and his feet planted as solidly on that unearthly soil as if he had been standing with his back to the fire in his own study.
Okay, so this is sort of Weston as we left him in Out of the Silent Planet. He's just a modern, world-trampling, gold-seeking, materialist scientist who's going to come in there and make money and maybe make discoveries for science. But all of his categories are very... I wouldn't even say they're pre-Columbian. I would say that they are the way, let's say, some 19th century modernist would imagine the Columbian expedition meets the New World. So that's how we begin.
Then, with a shock, he noticed that Weston was speaking to the lady in the old solar language with perfect fluency. On Malacandra, partly from incapacity and much more from his contempt for the inhabitants, he had never acquired more than a smattering of it.
Okay, so Weston has changed in the interim, and now Weston is speaking. So there's a solar language that's common among the planets and many species of the planets. It's sort of like a trade language, and so that's where Ransom, who was a philologist, who was interested in language, could go to Malacandra and he could learn the language. So then when he goes to Perelandra, he can speak with the woman because they're speaking the same language. And towards the end of Out of the Silent Planet, when the Oyarsa has Weston and Divine, and they're going to send them back, you see that Weston and Divine really don't speak the language very well because they're not very interested in the language. And again, there's sort of this sense of the Columbian exposition getting and meeting the inhabitants of Hispaniola and not bothering to learn the language or anything like that. They're just there for the gold. They're there for they're there for all the reasons that they're there, and the people there are, if nothing can be sort of taken and taken back and has value on Earth, it has no value. But already we see the sense that something has happened to Weston, and there's a deeper thing afoot.
Here was an inexplicable and disquieting novelty. Ransom felt that his only advantage had been taken from him. He felt that he was now in the presence of the incalculable. If the scales had been suddenly weighted in this one respect, what might come next?
Okay, so he felt that his advantage, because Ransom very quickly realizes he's there to keep the fall from happening, let's say. And Lewis is going to go into all of these kinds of ideas with a lot of subtlety and nuance in terms of, can you keep the fall from happening in one Earth? What's the relationship between let's say, the fall on one Earth and another Earth, and it's all full of these things.
He awoke from his abstraction to find that Weston and the lady had been conversing fluently, but without mutual understanding.
And there again, it's all full of this subtlety. So they can talk the same language, but they don't understand each other. And so it's not just a matter of knowing the language. Lewis has a sense that there's all of these worldviews, and Lewis in this novel is very sensitive to these worldviews. One of the things that I had heard in one lecture, I've listened to tons of lectures about Lewis and by people who knew him. Well, one of the criticisms of Lewis is that he seemed to have completely blotted out his experience as a soldier in the First World War. And you find it mentioned now and then, but there are parts in this story where you very much get the sense that this is someone who lived through war, and he's talking about violence. And so I've really been enjoying this book.
It is no use, she was saying. You and I are not old enough to speak together, it seems. The sea is rising. Let us go back to the islands. Will he come with us, Piebald?
Now, Piebald is what the woman calls Ransom, because he's sort of because of the way he was brought there, he's sunburned on one side and not on the other side, and when she sees him, he reminds her of certain animals that are there, certain beasts that are there on the planet.
Where are the two fishes? Said Ransom. They will be waiting in the next bay, said the lady. Quick then, said Ransom to her, and then, in answer to her look, no, he will not come. She did not presumably understand his urgency, but her eye was on the sea, and she understood her own reason for haste. She had already begun to ascend the side of the valley, with Ransom following her, when Weston shouted,
Now this is sort of a water world, and they get around by riding these fish.
No, you don't. Ransom turned and found himself covered by a revolver. The sudden heat which swept over his body was the only sign by which he knew that he was frightened. His head remained clear. Are you going to begin in this world also by murdering one of its inhabitants? He asked. What are you saying? Asked the lady, pausing and looking back at the two men with a puzzled, tranquil face. Stay where you are, Ransom, said the professor. That native can go where she likes. The sooner the better.
See, so there's Ransom. There's the woman. She's a native. She's like one of these Taino on Hispaniola. That's just what's going on. So what exactly is going on with Ransom or with Weston? And at this point, we don't really know. Ransom doesn't really know. And really, Weston doesn't really know why he's there either. And so there's some lovely parallelism between Ransom and Weston here that neither of them are understanding now. Now, Ransom is way ahead. He's been on the world a little bit, and he's got better knowledge of it. But Weston is a pawn of someone or something.
Ransom was about to implore her to make good her escape when he realized that no imploring was needed. He had irrationally supposed that she would understand the situation.
See, and right there, Lewis's sensitivity and the dialogue is full of that kinds of sensitivity that Lewis really tries to mind read prelapsarian Eve, as it were, to understand what she would and would not understand.
But apparently she saw nothing more than two strangers talking about something which she did not at the moment understand. That, and her own necessity of leaving the fixed land at once. You and he do...
Now there's a rule, there's a law that she has. It's almost like the don't eat from this tree over there. You may not sleep, you may not spend the night on the fixed land, you must spend the night on the floating islands.
Not come with me, Piebald? She asked. No, said Ransom, without turning round. It may be that you and I shall not meet soon again. Greet the king for me if you find him, and speak of me always to Maleldil. I stay here. We shall meet when Maleldil pleases, she answered, or if not, some greater good will happen to us instead. Then he heard her footsteps behind him for a few seconds, and then he heard them no more, and knew he was alone with Weston. You allowed yourself to use the word murder just now, Dr. Ransom, said the professor, in reference to an accident that occurred when we were in Malacandra. In any case, the creature killed was not a human being. Allow me to tell you that I consider...
Now, Lewis, many people have noted, writes a lot about animal cruelty in his other works. Lewis is very sensitive about these things. And Lewis also, out of the Silent Planet, you very much had the sense that, well, it's not, humans are not the only image bearers, as it were.
The seduction of a native girl as an almost equally unfortunate way of introducing civilization to a new planet. Seduction, said Ransom. Oh, I see. You thought I was making love to her. When I find a naked civilized man embracing a naked savage woman in a solitary place, that is the name I give to it. I wasn't embracing her.
So now you can see what Weston's filters are, what Ransom's understanding is, and Lewis is going to take this and, again, try to give us a sense of a prelapsarian perspective,
said Ransom dully, for the whole business of defending himself on this score seemed at that moment a mere weariness of the spirit. And no one wears clothes here. But what does it matter? Get on with the job that brings you to Perelandra. You ask me to believe that you have been living here with that woman under these conditions in a state of sexless innocence? Oh, sexless, said Ransom disgustedly. All right, if you like. It's about as good a description of living in Perelandra as it would be to say that a man had forgotten water because Niagara Falls didn't immediately give him the idea of making it into cups of tea.
And there again, Lewis's sense of he's exploring these nuances of perspective.
But you're right enough if you mean that I have had no more thought of desiring her than... But then... Comparisons failed him, and his voice died. Then he began again. But don't say I'm asking you to believe it or to believe anything. I am asking you nothing but to begin and end as soon as possible whatever butcheries and robberies you have come to do.
Okay, so that's where Weston is at. It's butcheries and robberies. Weston, this is in some ways the invasion of the Americas.
Weston eyed him for a moment with a curious expression. Then, unexpectedly, he turned his revolver to its holster. "Ransom," he said, "you do me a great injustice." For several seconds there was silence between them. Long breakers with white woolpacks of foam on them were now rolling into the cove, exactly as on Earth. "Yes," said Weston at last, "and I will begin with a frank admission. You may make what capital of it you please. I shall not be deterred. I deliberately say that I was, in some respects, mistaken, seriously mistaken, in my conception of the whole interplanetary problem when I went to Malacandra. Partly from the relaxation which followed the disappearance of the pistol, and partly from the elaborate air of magnanimity with which the great scientist spoke, Ransom felt very much inclined to laugh. But it occurred to him that this was possibly the first occasion in his whole life in which Weston had ever acknowledged himself in the wrong, and that even the false dawn of humility, which is still 99% of arrogance, ought not to be rebuffed, or not by him.
Now again, notice Weston is sort of a stereotype of a certain kind of scientist who is full of himself, sure of everything, and...
"Well, that's very handsome," he said. "How do you mean?" "I'll tell you presently," said Weston. "In the meantime, I must get my things ashore." Between them, they beached the punt and began carrying Weston's primus stove and tins and tent and other packages to a spot about 200 yards inland.
So, of course, Weston comes with all of his kit, and Ransom's been living naked in Perelandra.
Ransom, who knew all the paraphernalia to be needless, made no objection, and in about a quarter of an hour something like an encampment had been established in a mossy place under some blue-trunked, silver-leaved trees beside a rivulet. Both men sat down, and Ransom listened at first with interest, then with amazement, and finally with incredulity. Weston cleared his throat, threw out his chest, and assumed his lecturing manner.
Now, it's important, of course, to remember that Lewis lives in the academy, and so these characters, again, the Inklings are all these university-connected people, university-educated people, and it's like, well, yeah, this is how they are.
Throughout the conversation that followed, Ransom was filled with a sense of crazy irrelevance. Here were two human beings, thrown together in an alien world under conditions of inconceivable strangeness. The one separated from his spaceship, the other newly released from the threat of instant death. Was it sane? Was it imaginable that they should find themselves at once engaged in a philosophical argument which might just as well have occurred in a Cambridge combination room? Yet that, apparently, was what Weston insisted upon.
Now, it's interesting because Weston, of course, brings his world to this new world. And remember, as I said last time, Perelandra is younger than Earth. Mars is older than Perelandra, which is Venus, is younger than Earth. Perelandra, which is further away, or Perelandra, which is Venus, is younger than Earth. Malacandra, which is Mars, is further away and older than Earth.
He showed no interest in the fate of his spaceship. He even seemed to feel no curiosity about Ransom's presence on Venus. Could it be that he had traveled more than 30 million miles of space in search of conversation?
When I got that line, I knew I loved that line. I put that line right on Twitter. What a great line.
But as he went on talking, Ransom felt himself more and more in the presence of a monomaniac. Like an actor who cannot think of anything but his celebrity, or a lover who can think of nothing but his mistress, tense, tedious, and unescapable, the scientist pursued his fixed idea. The tragedy of my life, he said, and indeed of the modern intellectual world in general, is the rigid specialization of knowledge entailed by the growing complexity of what is known. It is my own share in that tragedy that an early devotion to physics has prevented me from paying any proper attention to biology until I reached the 50s.
So in other words, the problem with life, this reminded me so much of my Chris Kavanaugh conversation, people should stay in their lane. The problem is you can't go and chastise someone outside of your lane if you yourself stay in your lane. So Weston begins in saying, well, the problem was, PhDs just pilot higher and deeper. I used to believe people should stay in their lane, but I've come to a new realization.
To do myself justice, I should make it clear that the false humanist idea of knowledge as an end in itself never appealed to me. I always wanted to know in order to achieve utility. At first,
Wanted to achieve utility.
that utility naturally appeared to me in a personal form. I wanted scholarships, an income, and that generally recognized position in the world without which a man has no leverage. When those were attained, I began to look farther, to the utility of the human race.
So you have, well, first I cared about me, and now I have this noble idea about caring for the human race. Now remember, just a minute ago, he would have shot the woman just because, well, yeah, she might be a native.
He paused as he rounded his period, and Ransom nodded to him to proceed. The utility of the human race, continued Weston, in the long run depends rigidly on the possibility of interplanetary and even intersidereal travel. That problem I solved. The key of human...
So in other words, and you've heard this by certain people, we've got to get off this rock. We've got to go to Mars, or we've got to be able to save ourselves for humanity.
Human destiny was placed in my hands. It would be unnecessary and painful to us both to remind you how it was wrenched from me in Malacandra by a member of a hostile intelligent species whose existence, I admit, I had not anticipated.
So I wanted to get to Malacandra, and we were going to get gold and stuff, and we are going to colonize it, and there'd be elbow room, Laban's, breathing space for us. But, well, something happened. We're not going to talk about the Oyarsa or basically how they completely took us and sent us home.
Oh, not hostile, exactly, said Ransom, but go on. The rigors of our return journey from Malacandra led to a serious breakdown in my health. Mine, too, said Ransom. Weston looked somewhat taken aback by the interruption and went on. During my convalescence, I had that leisure for reflection which I had denied myself for many years. In particular, I reflected on the objections you had felt to that liquidation of the non-human inhabitants of Malacandra, which was, of course, the necessary preliminary to its occupation by our own species.
So this is what human beings do, and Lewis writes about this in other places. Human beings do what they do, just like they did in the Americas, and if they get out in space, they'll do it in space too. We make room for ourselves, we terraform, and we make it according to our will.
The traditional, and if I may say so, the humanitarian form in which you advanced those objections had till then concealed from me their true strength. That strength I now began to perceive. I began to see that my own exclusive devotion to human utility was really based on an unconscious dualism.
Oh my. So, in other words, once he encountered the superior power of the Oyarsa of Malacandra, and who basically, owned him and sent him packing, now I've discovered there's this an unconscious dualism had me. Well, what do you mean?
What do you mean? I mean that all my life I had been making a wholly unscientific dichotomy or antithesis between man and nature, had conceived myself fighting for man against his non-human environment. During my illness I plunged into biology, and particularly into what may be called biological philosophy. Hitherto, as a physicist, I had been content to regard life as a subject outside my scope. The conflicting views of those who drew a sharp line between the organic and the inorganic, and those who held that what we call life was inherent in matter from the very beginning, had not interested me. Now it did. I saw almost at once that I could admit no break, no discontinuity in the unfolding of the cosmic process. I became a convinced believer in emergent evolution.
I became a convinced believer in emergent evolution. Well, I wish I could move this thing. Why can't I move this thing? Now, I mean, well, as you can see, he's discovered spirituality. He's discovered that there was an implicit dualism, and a dualism that he would have to overcome, because on one hand, the colonization of the rest of the universe was thwarted by what seemed to be spiritual creatures. So now I'm going to get beyond the dualism that beget modernity, and have something that is actually totally will understand the whole thing now.
All is one. The stuff of mind, the unconsciously purposive dynamism, is present from the very beginning.
Now this stuff, all is one, the stuff of the mind, the unconscious purposive dynamism. I know some people might look at what's happening today and say, "Oh, that's so cutting edge." But it's been with us the whole time. Lewis himself keeps making the point that pantheism is the old shoe. None of this is new.
Here he paused. Ransom had heard this sort of thing pretty often before, and wondered when his companion was coming to the point. When Weston resumed, it was with an even deeper solemnity of tone. The majestic spectacle of this blind, inarticulate purposiveness thrusting its way upward and ever upward in an endless unity of differentiated achievements towards an ever-increasing complexity of organization, towards spontaneity and spirituality, swept away all my old conception of a duty to man as...
We should slow down. The majestic spectacle of this blind, inarticulate purposiveness thrusting its way upward and ever upward in an endless unity of differentiated achievements towards an ever-increasing complexity of organization, towards spontaneity and spirituality, swept away my old conception of a duty to man as such. This now is emergence. It's just emerging from the bottom, and it's going to fill the universe with Geist, spirit.
Such. Man in himself is nothing. The forward movement of life, the growing spirituality is everything.
Oh, the Geist is on the march.
I say to you quite freely, Ransom, that I should have been wrong in liquidating the Malacandrians. It was a mere prejudice that made me prefer our own race to theirs.
He's overcome. He's practically a transhumanist.
To spread spirituality, not to spread the human race, is henceforth my mission. This sets the coping stone on my career. I worked first for myself, then for science, then for humanity, but now at last for spirit itself. I might say, borrowing language which will be more familiar to you, the Holy Spirit.
Oh, so, you Christians may have known something in your primitive ways, but now, having climbed up the ladder of science, we have discovered spirit itself. And, well, now I see that I was wrong in Malacandra. I've transformed, I've transcended, I'm beyond where I was before.
Now what exactly do you mean by that? Asked Ransom. I mean, said Weston, that nothing now divides you and me except a few outworn theological technicalities with which organized religion has unhappily allowed itself to get encrusted.
What was so amazing about this was it was just so unbelievably fresh from so much that I've heard and seen of people with their new discovery of spirit. And this, of course, is Lewis writing in the early 40s, and it's been around a long time.
But I have penetrated that crust. The meaning beneath it is as true and living as ever. If you will excuse me for putting it that way, the essential truth of the religious view of life finds a remarkable witness in the fact that it enabled you, on Malacandra, to grasp, in your own mythical and imaginative fashion, a truth which was hidden from me.
I'm not going to name names, but there's so much of this around right now. And as we get beyond modernity, it sort of has to be around, because as modernity is increasingly threadborne, and if in fact, well, these old religions and spiritualities just sort of look threadbare, well, certainly there must be a new thing.
I don't know much about what people call the religious view of life, said Ransom, wrinkling his brow. You see, I'm a Christian, and what we mean by the Holy Ghost is not a blind, inarticulate purposiveness.
Blind, inarticulate purposiveness.
My dear Ransom, said Weston, I understand you perfectly. I have no doubt that my phraseology will seem strange to you, and perhaps even shocking. Early and revered associations may have put it out of your power to recognize in this new form the very same truths which religion has so long preserved, and which science is now at last rediscovering. But whether you can see it or not, believe me, we are talking about exactly the same thing. I'm not at all sure that we are. That, if you will permit me to say so, is one of the real weaknesses of organized religion. That adherence to formulae, that failure to recognize one's own friends. God is a spirit, Ransom. Get hold of that. You're familiar with that already. Stick to it. God is a spirit. Well, of course. But what then? What then? My spirit, mind, freedom, spontaneity. That's what I'm talking about. That
Spirit, mind, freedom, spontaneity. That's what I'm talking about. Oh.
is the goal towards which the whole cosmic process is moving. The final disengagement of that freedom, that spirituality, is the work to which I dedicate my own life and the life of humanity. The goal, Ransom, the goal, think of it, pure spirit, the final vortex of self-thinking, self-originating activity.
Pure spirit.
Final? Said Ransom. You mean it doesn't yet exist? Ah, said Weston. I see what's bothering you. Of course I know. Religion pictures it as being there from the beginning. But surely that is not a real difference. To make it one would be to take time too seriously.
When it has once been attained, you might then say it had been at the beginning just as well as at the end.
Now, in the audio recording, they clearly, if you listen to enough of these audiobooks, you can tell that sometimes they pause and they start the recording. They don't quite have now the reader is a little bit fresh, or they don't have the recording speed right.
And time is one of the things it will transcend.
By the way, said Ransom, is it in any sense at all personal? Is it alive? An indescribable expression passed over Weston's face. He moved a little nearer to Ransom and began speaking in a lower voice.
That's what none of them understand, he said.
It was such a gangster's or a schoolboy's whisper, and so unlike his usual orotund lecturing style, that Ransom for a moment felt a sensation almost of disgust.
Yes, said Weston. I couldn't have believed it myself till recently.
Not a person, of course. Anthropomorphism is one of the childish diseases of popular religion. Here he had resumed his public manner. But the opposite extreme of excessive abstraction has perhaps in the aggregate proved more disastrous. Call it a force, a great inscrutable force, pouring up into us from the dark bases of being. A force that can choose its instruments.
Now this is really important because this is, of course, Weston now. Now, Weston is going to, at the end of this chapter, something bad's going to happen to Weston, and he's going to become something else, or something else is going to possess him. And then later on, there's going to be a talk about, no, what's really at the bottom of everything. And so Weston here imagines that, well, we're all moving towards spirit, towards pure spirit. And of course, you know, there's a lot of Hegel through here, and
It is only lately, Ransom, that I've learned from actual experience something which you have believed all your life as part of your religion. Here he suddenly subsided.
So now I've discovered by science what you had by religion, but your religion is keeping you hopelessly back. Why don't you get rid of it so you can continue to climb and ascend me with pure spirit?
Again into a whisper, a croaking whisper, unlike his usual voice.
Guided, he said. Chosen, guided. I've become conscious that I'm a man set apart. Why did I do physics? Why did I discover the Western rays? Why did I go to Malacandra? It, the Force.
It's so funny, of course, because this is years before Star Wars. It's the Force. Oh, someone's knocking at my door. Hang on. Daniel's in a place. He's been there all month. It's going good. See how long it lasts. Back to the story. Oh yeah, the Force. The Force. Long before Star Wars.
Has pushed me on all the time. I'm being guided. I know now that I am the greatest scientist the world has yet produced.
Use the Force, Luke.
I've been made so for a purpose. It is through me that spirit itself is at this moment pushing me on to its goal.
Well, look here, said Ransom. One wants to be careful about this sort of thing. There are spirits and spirits, you know. Eh? Said Weston. What are you talking about?
and Lewis so amazingly captures this naivete that I find so often in some people. It's like spirit. It's like, oh, the spirit world. It's like Disneyland. What could go wrong?
I mean, a thing might be a spirit and not good for you. But I thought you agreed that spirit was the good, the end of the whole process.
I thought you religious people were all out for spirituality. What is the point of asceticism, fasts and celibacy and all that? Didn't we agree that God is a spirit? Don't you worship him because he is pure spirit? Oh, good heavens, no. We worship him because he is wise and good. There's nothing specially fine about simply being a spirit. The devil is a spirit. Now, your mentioning the devil is very interesting, said Weston, who had by this time quite recovered his normal manner. It is a most interesting thing in popular religion, this tendency to vociferate, to breed pairs of opposites, heaven and hell, God and devil.
Vociferate. The adjective vociferous. Divisive. That Google had the better, or Bing. Adjective, inclined to cause or undergo division into separate parts or groups. She was unsuccessful in holding a vociferous membership together. Biology of an organism reproducing by fission. Vociferate. Oh, wow, what a word.
I need hardly say that in my view no real dualism in the universe is admissible, and on that ground I should have been disposed even a few weeks ago to reject these pairs of doublets as pure mythology. It would have been a profound error. The cause of this universal religious tendency is to be sought much deeper. The doublets are really portraits of spirit, of cosmic energy. Self-portraits indeed, for it is the life force itself which has deposited them in our brains. What on earth do you mean? Said Ransom. As he spoke he rose to his feet and began pacing to and fro. A quite appalling weariness and malaise had descended upon him. Your devil and your God, said Weston, are both pictures of the same force. Your heaven is a picture of the perfect spirituality ahead, your hell a picture of the urge or nisus which is driving us onto it from behind. Hence the static peace of the one and the fire and darkness of the other. The next stage of emergent evolution, beckoning us forward, is God. The transcended stage behind, ejecting us, is the devil. Your own religion, after all, says that the devils are fallen angels. And you are saying precisely the opposite, as far as I can make out, that angels are devils who've risen in the world. Well, it comes to the same thing, said Weston. There was another long pause. Look here, said Ransom. It's easy to misunderstand one another on a point like this. What you are saying sounds to me like the most horrible mistake a man could fall into. But that may be because in the effort to accommodate it to my supposed religious views, you're saying a good deal more than you mean. It's only a metaphor, isn't it? All this about spirits and forces. I expect all you really mean is that you feel it your duty to work for the spread of civilization and knowledge and that kind of thing. He had tried to keep out of his voice the involuntary anxiety which he had begun to feel. Next moment he recoiled in horror at the cackling laughter, almost an infantile or senile laughter, with which Weston replied. There you go, he said. Like all you religious people. You talk and talk about these things all your life, and the moment you meet the reality you get frightened. What proof, said Ransom, who indeed did feel frightened, what proof have you that you are being guided or supported by anything except your own individual mind and other people's books? You didn't notice, dear Ransom, said Weston, that I'd improved a bit since we last met in my knowledge of
Oh, he has power.
Extraterrestrial language. You are a philologist, they tell me. Ransom started. How did you do it? He blurted out. Guidance, you know, guidance, croaked Weston. He was squatting at the roots of his tree with his knees drawn up, and his face, now the colour of putty, wore a fixed and even slightly twisted grin. Guidance, guidance, he went on. Things coming into my head. I'm being prepared all the time, being made a fit receptacle for it. Well, that ought to be fairly easy, said Ransom impatiently. If this life force is something so ambiguous that God and the devil are equally good portraits of it, I suppose any receptacle is equally fit, and anything you can do is equally an expression of it. There's such a thing as the main current, said Weston. It's a question of surrendering yourself to that, making yourself the conductor of the live, fiery, central purpose, becoming the very finger with which it reaches forward. But I thought that was the devil aspect of it, a moment ago. Well, that is the fundamental paradox. The thing we are reaching forward to is what you would call God. The reaching forward, the dynamism, is what people like you always call the devil. The people like me, who do the reaching forward, are always martyrs. You revile us, and by us come to your goal. Does that mean, in plainer language, that the things the Force wants you to do are what ordinary people call diabolical? My dear Ransom, I wish you would not keep relapsing onto the popular level. The two things are only moments in the single unique reality. The world leaps forward through great men, and greatness always transcends mere moralism. When the leap has been made, our diabolism, as you would call it, becomes the morality of the next stage. But while we are making it, we are called criminals, heretics, blasphemers. How far does it go? Would you still obey the life force if you found it prompting you to murder me? Yes. Or to sell England to the Germans? Yes. Or to print lies as serious research in a scientific periodical?
Pause there.
Yes. God help you, said Ransom. You are still wedded to your conventionalities, said Weston, still dealing in abstractions. Can you not even conceive a total commitment, a commitment to something which utterly overrides all our petty ethical pigeonholes? Ransom grasped at the straw. Wait, Weston, he said abruptly. That may be a point of contact. You say it's a total commitment. That is, you're giving up yourself. You're not out for your own advantage. No, wait half a second. This is the point of contact between your morality and mine. We both acknowledge. Idiot, said Weston. His voice was almost a howl, and he had risen to his feet. Idiot, he repeated. Can you understand nothing? Will you always try to press everything back into the miserable framework of your old jargon about self and self-sacrifice? That is the old accursed dualism in another form. There is no possible distinction in concrete thought between me and the universe. Insofar as I am the conductor of the central forward pressure of the universe, I am it. Do you see, you timid, scruple-mongering fool? I am the universe. I, Weston, am your god and your devil. I call that force into me completely. Then horrible things began happening.
Okay, so Weston gets to the end of this thinking, and this is so classic Lewis when you read in something like The Great Divorce, when the grumbler becomes a grumble. You see something pursuing its telos, and now we're going to discover, well, what is in fact at the end of the telos of Ransom, and it will be the end of Ransom. I'm not sorry, Ransom. Weston.
A spasm, like that preceding a deadly vomit, twisted Weston's face out of recognition. As it passed, for 1 second, something like the old Weston reappeared. The old Weston, staring with eyes of horror and howling, Ransom! Ransom! For Christ's sake, don't let them! And instantly his whole body spun round, as if he had been hit by a revolver bullet, and he fell to the earth, and was there rolling at Ransom's feet, slavering and chattering and tearing up the moss by handfuls. Gradually the convulsions decreased. He lay still, breathing heavily, his eyes open but without expression. Ransom was kneeling beside him now. It was obvious that the body was alive, and Ransom wondered whether this were a stroke or an epileptic fit, for he had never seen either. He rummaged among the packages and found a bottle of brandy, which he uncorked and applied to the patient's mouth. To his consternation,
it's so funny how brandy is sort of the universal medication.
The teeth opened, closed on the neck of the bottle, and bit it through. No glass was spat out. "Oh, God, I've killed him," said Ransom. But beyond a spurt of blood at the lips, there was no change in his appearance. The face suggested that either he was in no pain, or in a pain beyond all human comprehension. Ransom rose at last, but before doing so, he plucked the revolver from Weston's belt. Then, walking down to the beach, he threw it as far as he could into the sea. He stood for some moments gazing out upon the bay and undecided what to do. Presently he turned and climbed up the turfy ridge that bordered the little valley on his left hand. He found himself on a fairly level upland with a good view of the sea, now running high and teased out of its level gold into a continually changing pattern of lights and shadows. For a second or two he could catch no sight of the islands. Then suddenly their treetops appeared, hanging high up against the sky and widely separated. The weather apparently was already driving them apart, and even as he thought this, they vanished once more into some unseen valley of the way.
We'll let it go there, but Weston has begun to be transformed into something else that will become, and actually, I thought Richard Rowland nicely captured it captured Lewis's, how Lewis deals with evil here. Evil can be great and formidable, but it's also its banality and pettiness will come through in the unman that Weston will become. So I wanted to give you another little taste. I've got some plans for some other little tastes from the book. Very much read the book. It's a good book, and I think you will enjoy it. There's really a ton in it. So leave a comment. Let me know what you think.